Alright, we're starting. Let's give this a second. Today, welcome everybody. If you're in the class, you know where we are, and if you're a random person, welcome. Today we're going to get into Confucius. Well, one of the foundational philosophers of all of Chinese civilization. I should have put the school. This is Honors Class 100. It's basically an honors philosophy class, or they call it critical thinking, but philosophy. So welcome. We are going to start this, and let me get my stuff ready. Only problem teaching at home. Desk is way smaller than it should be. Okay, I don't even think I need my keyboard. That's not good. Here we go. I got lots of notes, and I got my book. It's great. All right, let us get started. Looks like the stream is working fine. The stream is working fine. All right, open that, open this, open that. Here we go. So today we're going to get into it. For anybody out there who doesn't have the book we're using, we are using the Penguin Classics, translated with intro and appendixes by D.C. Lau. He is the most prominent Confucian scholar in English in the last 100 years. Great translations, respects the material, doesn't just call him evil. This is 1979 published date, if you're curious. It's a pretty good edition. I like it. Some of Penguin's books are a little bit weird. Like if anybody pays attention to my streams, next week we're going to do Sun Tzu, the Sun Tzu translation from Penguin's. The translator really doesn't like Sun Tzu. I don't know why. So it's interesting. But that happens sometimes. But this book, D.C. Lau, respects the material. So it's pretty cool. All right, let's get in. So today we're not even into the meat. Next week, from next week, we're going to start getting into the meat of Confucius is what he wrote. Today we're going to get into the introduction. All right. And when appropriate, I try to have graphics. Older stuff is harder. Newer stuff is easier. Although, it depends on language too. Like, for example, it's easier for me to find Japanese stuff than Chinese stuff. Why? I speak Japanese, so I can search Japanese internet. So, much easier. All right. Let's get in. And this is supposed to be Confucius. There's lots of renderings of him artistically. This is one of the many. All right, so this is the kind of an overview of what we're aiming to do here with Confucian basics. Like, what is our aim? What are we going to cover, etc. So, when we get into talking about Confucius, he spends a lot of time talking about ethics, functional and rational ethics. Now, what is ethics? If you've never studied it, don't worry, I'll tell you. It's basically a system of rules by which one can be moral. That is what ethics are. Now, moral is what is good and wrong, or right and wrong, or good and evil. That's what morals are, right? So that's what we're dealing with here. So moral philosophy, I already kind of breaks. So all moral philosophy in all of the universe breaks down into two major schools. And D.C. Lau himself points this out, right? Several times in the introduction, if you read the first 30 pages or whatever, 20 pages. So moral philosophy generally breaks down into either the preeminence of character, right? What's inside you, or the preeminence of acts. It doesn't mean, and D.C. Lau also points this out many times, it doesn't mean it's only acts or only character, but kind of where's the origin of good morals? You know, is it forced actions, or is it from your character first? Confucius, by far, is character first. For him, character is what matters for moral action. We'll get into it later, but Confucius genuinely believes that right actions are an end to themselves. It's almost Kantian, or more correctly, Immanuel Kant is almost Confucian, is that, a good act is an act that's moral for the goodness of the act. Or being moral in yourself, right? Your moral character, being moral in your character is an end. It doesn't need a benefit. It doesn't need profit. It doesn't need recognition of other people. It by itself, it is good. So, he is definitely a character-first kind of guy. All right. Oh, and a quick note, we are going to have some Chinese on these slides. Now, when I say Chinese, it is Chinese characters. If you know nothing about Asia, I'm going to tell you a secret. Chinese characters are politicized. If you're curious, watch my Modern Asia class. It's also this semester we get a lot into it. Even like the form you choose to Romanize your Chinese characters is politics. So the big three, if you have no idea how the compartmentalization works, there's basically... So everybody, 100 years ago, everybody in East Asia and Vietnam. And there's a huge fight, like, is Vietnam East Asia? That's a great question. Kind of. That's the answer. But everybody used the same writing script in Asia until 100 years ago. So Japan, Korea, China, Northern Vietnam. Once the communists won, they thought Chinese is too hard, let's dumb it down. And it's literally called Simplified Chinese. And they even changed the way that the communists appropriately Romanized characters. So I am not using simplified, but I'm also not always using traditional. I'm using Japanese. Japanese is somewhere between traditional and simplified. But generally it's based off the traditional. Now, why would I do that? Because I speak modern Japanese. I don't speak Chinese, I'm sorry. And I'm working on learning, it's called Sino-Japanese, which is the classic Japanese, which is just Chinese. But that takes years. But I'm working on it. I have some books. I actually am trying to buy Confucius in classical Japanese. So we'll see how that goes. But for now, when you see a character, and if you speak Chinese, and you're like, Professor, this is not exactly right, it may not be. Although if you have a correction, I always take good corrections on my Chinese. If any goodness in these is because I have a bunch of native speakers correcting them for me. So thank you for previous students. So it's, I closed that. That was a mistake. That's because my escape key is all the way over there. All right, there we go. Let's bring that back. Sorry, folks. There we go. Oop. Yeah. So my little spiel on the note on my Chinese. And not every word has Chinese. Why? It's really hard to find classic Chinese in modern dictionaries. And I don't have a classic to modern Japanese dictionary yet. Next time I go to Japan, I think I'm going to try to get one. So, but we're going to get into core concepts. And both of these are in the intro. They're like page 10. I was going to say page 1. But right in the beginning, we get into these two core concepts in the base of Chinese. In the next slide, I'll go into them more. But these base concepts in Chinese thought. So first, we have the way, the Tao. And then the second one we have is virtue, which is Te. So these are two core concepts that predate Confucianism. Now, that's fine. There's no problem with that, right? A Western comparison would be like saying the Greek concept of logos, which is the truth, logic, the word, predates Christianity. Yes, but that's how ideas work, right? They iterate. So it totally makes sense. So these are two core ideas. We'll get into them more, but the short version of this is the way is almost like an analogy of how in English we'll say the truth. Like, remember the code of conduct we did? So it's like saying the truth. So the way is like the correct way to live one's life, or the sum total of all truths about the universe. That's what the way is. Virtue is an endowment men get from heaven. And when I say that, it's moral endowment. So it's like that natural, it's like a natural endowment of virtue. And if that doesn't make sense yet, don't worry, we'll get into it. Now, this is my summary. So these are kind of the fundamentals underneath the whole system, because they're Chinese fundamentals and classical Chinese. Now, also, when you say Chinese, that is another really political term, but it's a broad moniker to refer to the whole of. When I say Chinese, I do not mean the modern countries. I mean Chinese as in the language, and it's more especially the civilization. So whenever we hear Chinese in this class, I'm specifically referring to Chinese civilization. So the collection of the works, the collection of 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years of this, all of the things that have been put into Chinese civilization. So that's what we're talking about. All right. Next, the focus of Confucian, if you're going to get oversimplified, it's all about making a hierarchy of good men, which he calls gentlemen, versus small men. We'll get into this differentiation a little bit in the introduction, but very much once we start reading Confucius Analects proper. Like, once we start reading it, it's everywhere. But the goal is to make moral good men, and to transcend being small men. And small doesn't mean literally small, it means like small-minded. All right. Now, there's a critique here. Not necessarily, a little bit from D.C. Lau, but a lot in the wider talk about Confucius. People love to say the Analects have little in the way of metaphysics. Now, if you've never studied metaphysics, you're going to be like, Professor, what is metaphysics? Metaphysics literally means above physics. So, now you're like, Professor, there's nothing above physics. Yeah, oh, sure there is. Well, let me point it this way. Metaphysics is like the structure of reality. Like, how do we know what we know? And specifically it means like the structure of the non-physical universe. So ideas and truth and knowledge. That's all metaphysics. And if you're like, what the heck? Don't worry, folks. We're doing metaphysics all semester. So, but to give you an example, Confucius actually does have metaphysics. So, for example, acting morally for the moral act itself with no material benefit is a metaphysical concept, right? Because the physical is acting moral for a physical benefit, right? Profit. That is physics, right? That's physical. But then when you act moral for the sake of a moral act, that's above material reality. People would call it spiritual or metaphysical, transcendental. There's a bunch of words for that, but that's what that is. All right, and if you're like, wow, Professor, we're dumping off the deep end, welcome to studying the classics, everybody. All right. Oh, not that one, this one. Great. And finally, the reason you do it, and this is me restating Confucius in a, how would I even say it? You're restating Confucius in a more modern lens. Just you're using modern terminology to say what Confucius said. But the reason you would do it is because it is true. That's why Confucius said, because goodness is the truest thing. It's the way. It's the truth. It's virtue. So for Confucius, you act morally for the moral end itself because it is the good and the true. That's why you do it. But in a philosophical way, you could say, you do it because it's metaphysically true or spiritually true. So everybody's like, if you're a materialist, one of you, hi, I would say, regard polling of my students, I'd say 20 to 30% of the students at least are materialists. If you don't know what a materialist is, it means you don't think spiritual or metaphysical reality exists. It's only physical reality. So that might be a little bit of a reach, right? Like, why? Oh, that person's a sucker. Okay, if you're a materialist, you think that way. But if you're not, this is how the logic works. All right, so this is the super intro basic slide. We're going to go with the deep end from here. But any questions about this so far? Terminology I'm using, what these words mean? We're literally, the next slide, we're going to get into way and virtue more. I just want to point out they're important here. Any questions? As I sip my tea. That's the one advantage of being at home. It's really easy to make tea. And the odds of spilling on myself is low. Alright, waiting. It's either really easy or everybody's like panicked. So we'll figure it out later. Okay, let's keep going. Baseline of Chinese ethics. We already mentioned these, but I want to keep, giving them some credit. And did I not move it? Oh, I didn't. That's fine. Okay, so first we have the way. We talked about this already, the Tao, and that's the Chinese for it. So, like we said, just so you can see it, right? This is the sum total of all truths in the universe, right? D.C. Lau spends a lot of time talking about this. Let me get my book out. And these are fundamental for kind of understanding Chinese ethics and the way we can understand the kind of the mind. And again, when I say Chinese ethics, it's not a stretch to say even East Asian ethics. Japan, Korea, China all use some version of the Tao, right? Like this Chinese character means street, but it also means the correct way to do things. Easy example, like if you have martial arts in Japanese, which is the place that kept a lot of martial arts going without trying to kill all the practitioners. Anyway, right, like Aikido or Kendo or Kyudo, those are all, if you don't know what they are, Aikido's like a kind of wrestling, or like Judo, right, like it's wrestling. It's Ju, and then Do is the way. Or like Kendo is sword, the way of the sword. But it doesn't just mean a way, it means the correct way to use a sword. Or Kyudo is the Japanese traditional bow art. So it is the correct way to use a bow, like the truest way to use. That's what the implication in the Chinese. It comes close, like we said, to the Western concept of the truth, objective truth, as we talked about. That's what this idea is trying to get towards. So it's good to have that in your mind. Now, Te, I actually had the Chinese character for Te on the last page, but I need to copy past it. So we have virtue. What is it? Well, remember, there it all comes at once. Virtue, this is the endowment one gets from heaven, which it can also be cultivated. And we'll get to it later when we get to Confucius and education, but Confucius would also say less successfully, but let's not worry about that yet. That's too much detail. So, but it can be cultivated as well. And there's another way that D.C. Lau says to mention this, which I love it. It's virtue is something also like remembering what is right in sight of profit. I'm laughing because we live in materialist 21st century America, and that is a hard thing for many people to do. There's also a third kind of baseline concept here I want to explain that they mention a lot in the Confucius, and modern people have a hard time with this. The rights, which is Li. Oh, and if anybody here is a Mandarin speaker, yes, I realize my pronunciation is bad, but as I said before, I do not actually, in fact, speak Chinese. Now, why would that be a comment? Chinese has either 4 or 8 tones, or more or less, depending on your dialect. And the only way to tell what the tones are, well, there is a system of translation that does do it well, but they don't like to use it anymore in mainland China. But if you read the Chinese character, you can then know the correct pronunciation, but I don't know it, so it doesn't help me. Just a quick note. So, okay, what are the rights? These are insights into the past, info on morality. They're also rules for governing action in life. That's how D.C. Lau says it, but if you read it, you get kind of the implication that D.C. Lau is not a spiritual man, or especially religious. The rights are, in fact, religious rights. This would make the most sense if you're a Catholic or Orthodox or a Buddhist or a very traditional Christian, right? Like the liturgical calendar, like the calendar of the saints and prayers and feast days and what you do during religious observations. That is rights. Does this make sense? Like, we have to, the math says probably at least half the people here grew up Catholic. How do I know? If we were in person, I'd poll you. That's how we know. So, rights are the, like, religious practice. And he talks about it on 20. Let me find this. Oh, yeah, he says, the point about returning to the observance of rights is equally important. Rights were a body of rules governing action in every aspect of life, and they were the repository of past insights into morality. It is therefore important that one should, unless there is strong reasons to the contrary, observe them. Though there is no guarantee that observance necessarily leads to right behavior that is right, the chances are it will. So this is when you learn something from the religious tradition. And what D.C. Lau leaves out a bunch of, with only slight mention, is the vast pool that is traditional Chinese religion. Basically, since 1949, almost nothing in English has been written on it, because the Chicons tried to purge it all. And by purge, I mean they tried to burn all the books and kill all the people who remembered it. But there is a really good book series. I have a couple books of it from the library. It was written in the 1930s, I think. It's an attempt to collect all of the folk religion of China. One guy, one series. I think it's 15 books straight, just 15 books of rights, and of course written in the 20th century, right? So that's after 2,500 years after Confucius. So it's this giant canon of Chinese religious observations, demonology, correct clothing for festivals, all of that. That is the rights. So we're not going to get too far into it, but it's good to acknowledge that it exists, because it's there still today. It's much a different form, and it depends where you are and the diaspora and which country, but it's still a thing that exists. So any questions about this basics? These are basic, and if you read D.C. Lau, they're obvious. But any questions? I can't tell if it's either super easy because everybody did the reading, or everybody thinks this is gibberish. We'll find out when we talk about it next week. So that's what I hate about online. It's really hard to get a tell for people. But all right. Oh, we have somebody typing. Okay, and let's go here. Oh yeah. There we go. we go. We'll get into, that's a good question. Somebody asks, how is virtue cultivated? We'll talk about that. Let me see my slides. I actually have my future slides here. We're going to get on education, basically. So how do we learn? How are virtues acquired? We'll get into all that. And a lot of that is in the core content of the Analects itself talks about that. But we'll get into it. It's a whole process. That one could say that's what all of Confucius and all of Mencius is about. So it's a whole process we'll get into. Yep. So for now, just know it is cultivated, and we'll get into the how it is cultivated later. But it's that idea that it can be gained. For now, just keep that in mind, right? So one could be born with it, but one can also gain it. That's what we need to know for now. And we'll get into it as we go. Much of the Analects is talking about how it is gained. And the Analects, let's be honest, is more indirect. When we get to Mencius, he's much more direct. Mencius is basically Confucius too. He's his disciple. All right, great. That's a good question. All right. Now, real quick, the book talks about this slightly, but it's good to know the period that this takes place in. It mentions that Confucius lived in the 5 and 400s BC. This period is called the Spring and Autumn period of Chinese history. What you need to know is China was not a unified, at this period, was not a unified kingdom, or empire, as China calls itself, right? It had been in the past, and it was not in this period. So, part of all of what Confucius is trying to write, even the intro, right, it talks a bit about how he never really was that successful at finding a job, and he ended up being a teacher. He was also trying to find solutions to the problem of several hundred years of straight civil war, right? So we're stuck in a civil war, how do we fix this? So a lot of biggest Chinese ethics, and a lot of world ethics come out of times of chaos, when people are trying to figure out, like, how do we fix these problems we're currently living in. So, something to keep in mind. And it's a nice picture of the period, so I just wanted to show it to you. Lots of chariot fighting, if you're curious. It was the tank of 2,500 year ago China. Alright. So let's get into Confucian virtues. We're probably gonna only scratch the surface of these, because this is a deep well that we could spend a lot of time digging into. And I'm checking my notes. Yeah, here we go. Alright, so the first most important virtue we're going to dig into, that we don't need to right now, benevolence. And all of this is in the book. If you have your book, let me get mine too. Let me start on 15. Alright, so we're going to get into benevolence. At the basic, this benevolence is the foundation for all of Confucian morals. So that makes it pretty important, right? And there's also a divine link to morals, but we'll get to that a little bit later. Let's see. So benevolence, at its most simple, if we're going to explain what it is, it's something like love and obligation between members of the family. That's kind of what benevolence is. It's much more than that, but it's this idea that all ethics start at the family level, and it's love plus obligation, not just love. Now, I point that out because in the modern West, right, there's this idea that love is pure, just how you feel about it, right? And there's been a loss of that obligation half. I would say in tradition, even in the West, there's the idea that there has to be love plus obligation. For Confucius, this is the start of it. So kind of the core here is that double love. And even D.C. Lau on 1415, he mentions this. He says it this way: benevolence, Gen, that's what that character is read in Chinese. And when you're reading the book, it is good to keep a sideboard or notes or your own little dictionary. D.C. Lau, for many times, will just use the italicized Chinese, changed into Roman characters, instead of writing benevolence all the time. So sometimes he'll say Gen, sometimes he'll say benevolence. But he says this: it is the most important moral quality a man can possess. Although the use of this term was not an innovation in the part of Confucius, it is almost certain that the complexity of its content and the preeminence it attained among moral qualities were due to Confucius. And he says this: that it is the moral quality a gentleman must possess is clear from the following saying. And he quotes Confucius here, and Confucius says, if the gentleman forsakes benevolence In what way can he make a name for himself? The gentleman never deserts benevolence, not even for as long as it takes to eat a meal. If he hurries and stumbles, one may be sure that it is in benevolence that he does so. So, and as he says immediately after this, D.C. Lau says, not Confucius, in some contexts, the gentleman and the benevolent man are almost interchangeable terms. And then he gives us some traits of a benevolent man, free from worries and fears, and then he's asked about what makes a good benevolent man, and then he gets a little bit sidetracked, and he talks about, here we go, this is on 15 if you have your book. A benevolent man helps others to take their stand insofar as he himself wishes to take a stand, and gets others there insofar he wishes to get himself there. The ability to take analogy of what is near at hand is called the method of benevolence. And then we get two other side concepts. I'm not super worried about these, but I'll explain them. There's the concept of shu and chung. Shu is, how does he say this? Discovering what other people wish, right? So if we have love and obligation to other people in society, we have to understand those people, and so that's that idea of shu. And the other one, chung, is doing one's best. Where is this? The quote is from 16 in the intro. He says, the quote is, "Every day I examine myself on 3 counts. In what I have undertaken on another's behalf have I failed to be chung." Again, he is asked something else. I should serve as ruler with chung. Finally, he has also said that detailing others should be chung. And this word, chung, means doing one's best. And there's a footnote here, footnote 6, it says, translators tend to use the word loyal as the sole equivalent for chung, even in early texts. And he says this mistake is due to the failure to appreciate the meaning of the word changed in the course of time. In later uses, it meant loyalty or blind devotion, but in the early times, it means doing one's best. So, to be benevolent, part of it, not the whole thing, but parts of it include doing your best, understanding what other people want. So it's a complex virtue, and this complexity is all due to Confucius. He mentions on 16 as well, this is D.C. Lau, not Confucius. Part of this too includes love your fellow men. And he didn't elaborate. But again, does this sound familiar? Yeah, it's almost like the Great Commandment. And if you don't know what the Great Commandment is, we'll get into that later when we get to St. Augustine. The Great Commandment is, it's from the New Testament in the Bible. It's love your neighbor, love your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. So the Great Commandment for Christians is love God, love your neighbor, love yourself. So in Confucius, the kind of Great Confucian Commandment is, fulfill your love and obligation to your neighbors. So it's a similar obligation. And then we get a lot of detail here. And he especially gets into the, how do we love our neighbor? What does love mean? What is the difference? He goes in here, he gets really lost in the difference between one's fellow man and the common man. So we start to get a bit of a class system. We will definitely get into that, don't you worry. And where is this? And then we get into relationship detail. If you did not yet have your book, this is on 18 if you have it. So he starts to talk about, 17 and 18, he starts to talk about, 16 and 17. He starts to talk about the natural Confucian relationships. And I'm going to skip forward to a slide where I'm going to summarize these, and then I'm going to use some of D.C. Lau's wording. Here we go. Oh, I can use that. That's right. Oop. So the core, pretty much the only thing people remember from Confucius sometimes is his extrapolation on filial piety and the 5 relationships. Now, if you don't know what filial piety means, it's a word that is technically an English word, but only in the most technical sense. What I mean is, nobody ever uses this word in English who is not an Asian scholar. I have never heard it used. I've never read it, except when I study about Asia. So what does it mean? Filial is the same word as family. And piety, what's a pious person, right? One who fulfills their religious obligations well. So this means like religious devotion or devotion to your family. But the English implication and the strong Confucian implication is it's basically the weight of a religious obligation. Now, I point that out because there's also another stream of academic thought in the West that loves to say, quote, Confucianism is not a religion, it is just a philosophy. No, or more correctly, pretty much every philosophy is in some way a religion, but explicitly Confucianism is a religion in the way that it has what you worship, how you live your life, what's your metaphysics, what's the structure of spiritual reality. In all that way, it is a religion, in my professional opinion, as somebody who teaches this too much. And it's in the word, right? Like literally, this is your religious obligation to your family. Now, if we have any East Asians here or Southeast Asians, a lot of this might sound familiar. So, okay, we're going to get into this a little bit before we keep going on the rest of the virtues. Why? It's good to know these 5 relationships, and he does mention them on 16 to 18. He gets into them. Let me see here. He mentions from 16 to 17, like under the system succession passes from eldest son by principal wife. He talks about how the feudal lord system led straight into, here we go. This is 18, second paragraph. Confucius made natural love and obligation obtaining between members of the family the basis of a general morality. The 2 most important relationships within the family are those between father and son, and the elder brother and the younger brother. So let's get into that. So we have father and son, elder brother, younger brother. And I'll quote D.C. Lau here again. The love one owes to one's parents is called hisao, while the respect due to one's elder brother is ti. If a man is good son and a good brother, or good younger brother, at home, he can be counted on to behave correctly in society. So basically, your family relationships echo your public relationships. And if you think about it logically, I think Confucius, it seemingly Confucius does have a point, right? Like imagine if you're a horrible father and a horrible older brother, or you're a horrible son and a horrible younger brother. How do you suddenly go out into the world and suddenly you're like a great subordinate at work? Like you're really good at it. None of those traits you had in your home transfer out to the world. And you remember back that first slide where we said Confucius focuses on character? For Confucius, that makes no sense. He's like, no, if your character is to be a horrible person, you're not going to suddenly stop being a horrible person outside. He would probably say something like, you could probably fake it in actions for a little while, right? But you're not actually a good person. Again, seems logical if you know how humans work, right? If you've ever interacted with a human that's not yourself. Let's keep quoting here. He says, the love one, he has a quote from the book. This is from Confucius. It is rare for a man whose character is such that he is a good son, an obedient young man, to have the inclination to transgress against his superiors. It is unheard of for one who has no such inclination to be inclined to start a rebellion. He goes on to draw the logical conclusion that, quote, being good being as good as a son and obedient as a young man is perhaps the root of a man's character. So in Confucian ethics, the ethics start in your family. And then he mentions he goes on to draw a logical conclusion that, quote, then he says, in later Confucianism, an undue emphasis put on being a good son. But we can see here that even in early Confucian teaching, this is one of the most basic virtues. And then he says here, the obvious inverse is also true. If being a good son makes a good subject, being a good father will also make a good ruler. So again, right, if a good king isn't a good father, he's not a good king. It goes both ways. And then he says here, he gets into then, how does love work? Well, love for people outside of one's family is looked upon as an extension of the love for members of one's own family. One's consequence of this view is that love, and by so the obligation to love, decreases by degrees as it extends outwards. Geographically, one loves members of one's own family more than one's neighbors more than one's own villagers, and so on. Socially, one loves members of one's own social class more than another class. Thus, and we'll talk about class. Lao doesn't, but we will. So it'd be surprising if benevolence was confined to one's fellow man. So for Confucius terminology, right? And he even mentions that you still love the common people. You love them, but a lesser degree. So you love everyone, but in Confucius terminology, he would say one is generous to the common people. So he is the word he uses. And it's keeping with his general attitudes towards obligations. And how do obligations work? Well, they're towards others. They should be in proportion to the benefit we have received from them. Let's get some more examples of that. So, for example, the third major relationship is husband-wife. So, these are mutual relationships, but not strictly equal relationships. So, again, do we have obligations between husbands and wife? Yes. What are easy examples of this in all of human history, right? Husband protects the wife, handles the forward-facing things. The wife generally defers to the husband, helps, literally has the children, keeps his life going. Many of my class, when we're live, I'll ask you guys to brainstorm these things. But many people say, like, oh, the husband works and the wife takes care of the home. I'm going to spoil it for you folks. Trad China, like traditional everywhere else, is 95% farmers. Why does that matter? Wife's farm, folks. It's a myth. If you've heard, women always stayed in the home and men worked until 5 minutes ago. Bupkis. It's a lie. It's not true. Most of human history, men and women and children worked the farm together all day, every day. But Professor, what about a newborn? You literally carry the newborn in a sling on your back and then breastfeed when it's time. And then you just, as you're working. That's how babies worked for human history. So they'd work together, but husbands are still to protect their wives, right? They have obligations to each other. They have obligations to each other's family. So that's the next relationship. And of course, any of these that are gendered, the opposite gender is also true, right? Mother, son, father, daughter, older brother, younger sister, older sister, younger sister, etc. Another obligation here that you can extrapolate from these is friend and friend. Right? It's not just friends are, for fun, or friends are, how can I even say it? Friends are occasional. For the classic thought, friends are a lifetime of obligation and love. They're long-term. We'll get into this too when we get to the Greeks and the Romans. Greeks and Romans had the same view. Friendship is love and obligation for life. And then finally, ruler-subject. Right, so the ruler and the subject have obligations, right? The subject has to pay taxes and follow the laws, etc. The ruler must take care of the subject, watch over their well-being, like we said in this, what was this? Page 19. Be generous to the common people. So there's a mutual obligation here, and we'll get into way more of how this all executes. But basically there's a concept here that good moral personal life and well-run moral state are the same. They're connected. They're the same thing. There's not a difference. So these are all connected, right? As a moral, ethical, political theory, there's not a separation here. So for Confucius, all ethical and moral theory and political theory starts at home. So if the homes are well run and they're pious and benevolent, then everything else in society will be benevolent. And if the homes aren't benevolent, nothing else can be. So that's why I'm going really hard on this before we get to any other virtues. Because it seems like a aside if you read the book, but actually this is the core. And you could argue, too, one reason I'm doing this early, this is also, in East Asia in general, this is the part of the Confucian system that even though for about 70 years now, most people haven't studied Confucius directly, this is still ongoing. Let me give you some practical examples, right? So the parent-child relationship. This isn't just what we said about love and obligation, but what does that mean specifically, right? I'll give you some examples. So we said before, obligation is proportional to the benefit you receive from someone. So, for example, parents and children. In the Confucian relationship, what do your parents give to the children? Literally life, right? They give you life, and they make sure you don't die before you're an adult. That is huge. One could say unrepayable. the obligation between children, two children from their parents. So how does it work in practice, right? So parents raise their children, then the children's obligation to fulfill their relationship to their parents is be successful, right? If anybody here is East Asian, you'll know something about this. Or if you have any friends who are, you might hear about this, right? It's that idea that parents now must succeed to fulfill their parents, the obligation they have to their parents. And when parents get old, what happens? You ready? The parents must take care of the children. The children must take care of the parents in turn. Also part of this obligation, remember how these are all tied together? Part of the obligation is to having a husband or a wife, right? One way you fulfill your obligation to your parents is being married. So these are all interdependent. Any questions or comments about these? And we will come back to these as we go. I just wanted to get them out there right away. And as we go through the other virtues, you'll see how they interact with this list. But any questions about this? Questions, problems, concerns? Did it make sense? And if you hear that, that's my son. Hi, Joe! My son does not understand why we can't play truck and plane. The concept of work has not entered his 2-year-old mind yet. He thinks I'm just like having fun in here by myself. Okay, great. Somebody says makes sense. Interesting. Cool, let's keep going. Alright, back to ethics. How are we doing on time? We're getting about as far as I expected. Great. So we're back here. Let's get back to the virtues. And this puts us back on the D.C. Lau train, right? If you read D.C. Lau, you're like, Professor, there was a little bit of that in there, but you added a bunch. Well, yes. For those of you who don't know me, I teach at least 2 classes a semester where I deal with Confucius. I say at least 2, sometimes 3 or 4, because it's such a foundation of East Asian tradition that if you skip it, the rest doesn't make sense. But once you understand it, basically the last 2,500 years of Asian history makes a lot more sense. That's one reason we're getting into it too. Okay, the next one, wisdom. Hey, let's go here. What's wisdom? It's the ability to distinguish right from wrong. And going into metaphysics too, it's the idea that right from wrong are clear concepts that we can know as humans. Yes, other things here, it also includes knowledge of men. This is again coming from D.C. Lau. What page? This is the 20s, like 22. So this means like a good judge of character. So wisdom is being able to judge character of people. Wisdom is also the trait that is the acquisition of wisdom, and you get it. You can be born with it, but it's also through book learning and through difficulty. And the most important part of wisdom, according to D.C. Lau and Confucius, is self-honesty, right? So these are all part of one virtue. Now, again, I don't think this is necessarily against Western wisdom. Western wisdom is probably something like knowledge plus experience, right? It's the ability to see truth about reality, but it has an experience element to it as well, right? It's not just a lot of stuff, right? We'd call it maybe intelligence, or not even knowledge, maybe intelligence, or maybe a know-it-all. But wisdom is a complicated concept for sure in Confucius. And if you read D.C. Lau, he does mix, which Qi is wisdom, and then Jung is courage. He actually puts these together. So what is courage? Well, courage, to quote Confucius, to know what is right and leave it undone. That is a lack of courage. So if wisdom is knowing what is right and understanding people, courage is doing what is right. And D.C. Lau does point out that great good and great evil both require courage. Courage is all about how you use it. What page is this on? 23. Where are you? 23. Here we go. There's a couple quotes here on courage, which is pretty funny. Yeah, 24 actually. He dislikes those who, while possessing courage, lack the spirit of the rights. Equally, quote, being fond of courage while detesting poverty, will lead men to unruly behavior. So then here's a quote from Lao. Courage, to be virtue, must be in the service of morality. Hence, when asked whether gentlemen considered courage a supreme quality, Confucius answered, quote, for the gentleman it is morality the supreme, possessed of courage but devoid of morality. A gentleman will make trouble, while a small man will be a brigand. And we have that small man versus gentleman again. So even a gentleman will make trouble if he doesn't have morality but courage, and a small man, right, a completely unethical man will just be a brigand if all you have is courage. Makes sense, I think. It's a pretty clear one. And again, courage in English, I've teach so much Confucius it's hard for me now, but courage does seem to imply much more physical courage than moral courage. But we do have moral courage, but think about that, right? In English, I kind of have to say, that's a courageous person. I think we tend to think more of physical courage, right? Somebody who's willing to risk danger. And to be moral courage, I have to put the word moral in front of it, right? Whereas in the classic Chinese, courage has the moral sense to it as well, especially if we're talking about Confucius. All right. And by the way, at any time, if you have questions about these or they seem unclear, ask a question. But if you don't ask questions, I assume you all read the book and it's easy. Next we have Shin, which is this Chinese character. Reliable word in keeping your promises. Yes. And most importantly too, part of Shin is consistency between words and actions. And even D.C. Lau even mentions the boy who cried wolf as a counterpoint, right? Like, the boy who cried wolf lacks Shin. So it's the agreement between your words and your actions. So again, this goes back to, even though Confucius is character first, keeping your word is part of being courageous, part of being moral, for sure. And then next we have this one, Reverence, Qing, which is the quote D.C. Lau of what he translates as, this is on 26 if you're curious, the frame of mind of a man taking part in sacrifice. And it's also something like the fear of failing your responsibility to others. So remember this list I showed you? That's one reason I did this list first. Part of morality in this list is the fear of failing these obligations. That's actually so reverence. In English, reverence does mean religious observation, right? Like if you're reverent, I'll go back to my being Catholic again, because Protestants do this too, but it's almost a truism for Catholics, right? Like bowing during your liturgy is reverence, right? You're showing reverence to the thing you're worshiping. Or if you're Buddhist and you go to a Buddhist shrine or Buddhist temple, right? And when you're praying, if you bow, that's reverence. Or if you're Shinto and you go to a Shinto kami, which is a god. If you don't know what Shinto is, we'll get there. Our last book, actually, I'll explain it. But if you're at a shrine and you're praying and you're bowing, that's reverential. So you're paying due religious reverence to something and respecting something. So reverence is part of these relationships. And by the way, both ways, right? So like we talked about husband and wife. A husband should revere his wife and a wife should revere the husband. A father should revere the son and the son should revere the father, right? Of course, these are not equal relationships. Like the elder tends to be higher than the younger, but they're not one-way relationships. That's kind of the good thing to keep in mind here when we're talking about obligations. All right, so that's reverence. Next, dutifulness or duty or righteousness. I have dutifulness here. I kind of want to have righteousness, though. Righteousness almost feels better. And this is yi. It's duty or rightness, carrying out of one's duty. D.C. Lau basically says, we don't have a word in English that is a direct translation. If you don't speak two languages, or you don't speak especially two languages that are quite different, like even Romance languages, Latin-based languages, they're a bit different from English, because English is Germanic, right? But the difference between like English and Chinese or English and Japanese, you'll have whole words that just, how do you translate that word? Oh, it's a sentence in English. Dutifulness is one of those words that's actually a sentence in English. So some of the data here, it's carrying out your duty, but it's also moral duty. So acting good in itself because it is good and not for like payment that is dutifulness. So you're doing something for the rightness of the action. So if reverence is kind of your fear of failing, dutifulness is filling out those obligations because it is righteous, right? So once you kind of realize the moral rightness of an action and you're doing it, that is, in fact, dutifulness. And let me look for a quote here. I've taught this book so many times. I have 2 sets of notes. Let me see if I'm missing anything or anything I want to add here. So, and dutifulness is also not just being scared of the thing, but doing one's duty is dutifulness. So dutifulness is the first one we hit. It's like courage. It's action. And like Shin, being reliable in word and keeping your promises. If reverence is the fear of not fulfilling your obligations, dutifulness is the execution. This is doing your moral action. And as Lao said, quote, earlier we said that Confucius was more interested in moral virtue of men than the qualities of their acts, but no moral system can be solely based in moral virtues, and dutifulness is that execution. And it's also what he says this way: the standard by which all acts can be judged and itself cannot be judged. So dutifulness is that fulfilling of all of those obligations that one should be doing. Hopefully that makes sense. People seem quiet. So either the stream crashed or it's really easy. I hope it's the second one. This is the foundation for the whole book. So if it makes sense and it's pretty easy, great. Let's keep going. Boop, bink. All right. Great. Yeah, people seem fine. Decree of heaven. This is where we start to get into the when people are like, Confucianism is not a religion, it is just a philosophy, except it's backed up by something called the decree of heaven. Thank you to the person who says we got it. Great. So let's get into the decree of heaven. This, Tian Ming, is a moral imperative. And so Tian is heaven, and then Tian Ming is heaven's decree. This is the idea that, heaven cares about people's welfare. So heaven itself is invested in these relationships working out. So both it matters for the father, but it also matters for the ruler. So for example, I'm going to use a quote from Lao, but remember, all of these things, if it's true for a ruler, it's true for a dad, or it's true for an elder brother, or for a wife, or for a husband. So heaven cares about the welfare of the people, so a ruler has to as well. And if they don't, they lose the support of heaven. So these are not, all of these relationships have weight for the person above and below, and one can fail their role trying to fulfill these things. Let me see, is there anything else I want to add here? Yeah, that's the big point here. So all those 5 relationships, there's heaven basically has a decree, which is you must fulfill these things. There's also the second part here. I didn't put it on the slide. I don't know why. He then gets into Ming, which is destiny. It's a slightly different word. Do I have it on here? Hold on. I do have it on here. We'll get to destiny in a second. There's also a little bit of, it seems like an aside, but as we go, this will be more and more important. A quick aside on profit. Why did I put this here? This feels weird. He does mention it in the book, and then he leaves, and then he comes back. But a quick point on profit here. Page 20. We're kind of going back in time a little bit. Let me find this. In Confucianism, it's not, he says it here, he says, this starts on 19. Take the first point first. It is a central tenet of teachings of Confucius that being moral has nothing to do with self-interest. To be more precise, to say 2 things have nothing to do with each other is to say there is no relationship whatsoever between them, either positive or negative. If being moral has nothing to do with pursuing one's own interest, neither has it anything to do deliberately going against it. Why then, may be asked, is it so important to emphasize this lack of relationship between the two? The answer is this. Of all the things that are likely to distort a man's moral judgment and deflect him from his moral purpose, self-interest is strongest. The most persistent and the most insidious. So, profit and self-interest in traditional Confucianism is seen as a distraction from morality at best. It's not that morality and self-interest are opposed. They have no relationship to each other. But profit and self-interest is a distraction, right? And again, going back to this. Can this interfere with one person's selfish self-interest? Sure, of course, right? I'll give you an example, right? A husband always being filial and loyal to his wife. Is that always in his self-interest? Or is there sometimes when he'd rather do something else? Of course he'd rather do something else. Or, is it always easy for a son to take care of his father in his old age? Of course not, right? Like, if it's pure self-interest, we all have self-interest to, like, I don't know, put your parents in a nursing home or something, right? So, self-interest is a distraction from morality for a Confucius. Now, in the 2,000 years since Confucius wrote, eventually, Confucianism in its various forms becomes either ambivalent to profit-making or openly hostile. The most openly hostile might be Chosun Korea. We're not talking about it in this class, but it's early modern and medieval Korea, late medieval, early modern Korea. They're so against merchants. They lost money for like 100 years. Like, they just stopped using money. Like, that's how much they didn't like merchants. It's amazing. If you want to know more about that, we talk about that in my Modern Asia class. But Confucius get pretty hardcore. But at this early point, it's just more of a distraction. And we have a question here. If one acts of rightness is not morally fitting to the situation, but they had a moral motive, is it considered yi? Well, the moral motive is... how would I even say it? The dutifulness is the act, right? So that's the yi. So correctly fulfilling your duty is yi, but kind of having the desire to do the right thing. Like, say you do the wrong thing, but you tried. The trying would be benevolence, but yi would be actually doing it correctly. Does that make sense? So benevolence would be that desire to do it right, but dutifulness is actually doing it right. So the want is benevolence, but the action is the yi, right? The dutifulness. Because if you mess it up, are you being dutiful? Not really. Yes, and that's a great question. And yeah, this is where it gets complex, right? Because where's intent and where's action? Dutifulness is action. Benevolence and wisdom are intent and mental states, right? So, but of course, Confucianism needs both. Oh, and when you look at this, it is good to look at them like kind of like a tier list, right? Most important, very important, pretty important, important but not the same level of importance. So we kind of decrease as we go along here. It's not saying that decree of heaven isn't important, but benevolence is the ascendant, most important. That's what we're saying. Man, we're almost out of time. Wow. Great. I thought we were gonna run out of go too fast. Nope. That's fantastic. I'm so happy. Okay, destiny. Let's do destiny. Answer some questions, and we'll keep going next time. We'll finish the introduction. All right. So destiny is linked. And if you look at the Chinese, even if you don't speak Chinese, you can see the difference. See this little house-looking doobie? Mei, sometimes the Japanese, right? But in this case, it's Ming. So Ming and Ming. See here? There's a link here between these two concepts. And again, with Chinese characters, generally the meaning is similar, even if it's used in different... So there's a link between the decree of heaven and destiny, but it's not exactly the same. Destiny, and this is with a capital D, is more like bringing about what comes to pass. It's what's meant to happen. And I use the capital D very specifically. In ancient Greeks and Rome, which we will get to, destiny was considered to be a god, right? And in ancient Greece and Rome, actually, one reason great men became gods is because to go against destiny, it was seen as like, to go against the plan of the gods, one had to be at least a demigod. But with Confucians, it's not exactly that. But it's kind of pointing out you can't control everything, right? So that's why morality really is internal first, action second. Because what if you have a bad destiny? It doesn't mean you can't be moral, but you might not be able to control everything. So this is kind of them regarding the kind of the vastness of things you cannot control. So destiny is that, right? It's the things that you not necessarily are part of the realm of what you control. Do you have anything else I want to say about this? Yeah, this is another thing Lao says on 29. Some events happen independent of humans, and that's what destiny is. So, and it's also including, it is the one's lot in life, including keeping to one's social class. There's also something here of like how you have personal agency, but not necessarily social agency, like changing your stratification. And this also, Confucius does this to say, instead of life pursuits, like material life pursuits, you're focusing on pursuing morals. That's kind of what this is on. And Mencius will give us much more elaboration on his opinion of destiny, but it's like, don't sweat the stuff you can't control, focus on being moral. That's what he's trying to say with destiny. And again, to a modern ear, that can tweak people the wrong way. But when it comes to morals, for Confucius at least, it makes sense. And this is where we're at. I think we're out of time, because we're over in a minute. So I'm going to leave it here. Next class, we'll get into the rest of the intro. So kind of the how do we cultivate morals, which somebody asked. Right? How is this done? How do we get these virtues? How does the system kind of execute? What parts are we missing? We're going to get into stuff like, how is this learned through literature and music? I'm looking at my notes. Yeah, the ultimate purpose of government, how does this lead to politics, etc. So we're right on the cusp of that, but we will do that next time. So for now, I think we're out of time. So if you have any final questions, I will answer them in the Discord chat. For every random person watching, thank you for joining us. We'll be back on Tuesday, and we'll do the next part of this, if you're curious. And for everybody else, I'll be back in the channel real quick. And then for the rest of y'all, have a great day.